I was talking with some friends recently. They were part of a network not too dissimilar from ours. That they just so happen to also be going through the Sermon on the Mount, and I think they had like a team call. Like they're trying to figure out like how do we go through the Sermon on the Mount. Like I think they're kind of debriefing the message from the week before and kind of what worked, what didn't work. And the thing that they were talking about is like how do we talk about the Sermon on the Mount? How do we go through the Sermon on the Mount without being too convicting or too like we don't want to shame people as they go through the Sermon on the Mount. And if you've ever read the Sermon on the Mount, it's like actually I don't know if that's an option. I don't actually think there's a way to go through the Sermon on the Mount and not somehow be convicted, to be exposed in some way, shape, or form. Because it is, I don't know, there's a way that we read Scripture, right? But Scripture also reads us back. And I think the Sermon on the Mount is one of those classic examples that highlights to you, like, oh, this is, it examines your life and challenges you to go further than you want to go, than maybe you even know how to go. And so I'm feeling all of that this morning as I look at a lot of text. But, as Sherry mentioned, we're in our second series looking at the Sermon on the Mount and the alternative community it creates. Jeremy last week, he gave us sort of a grounding and an understanding that the Beatitudes as context for the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. I thought that was so helpful and so important because maybe kind of as he mentioned, the Sermon on the Mount is really the largest catalog we have of Jesus' teaching. Like, we have reason to believe that Jesus, when he traveled around, like the Sermon on the Mount or pieces of it would have been what he would have shared in every location that he would have been in. It's like all of his miracles, all of his teachings, all the parables, they kind of tie back to the Sermon on the Mount in some way. And actually the Beatitudes, what I've been told, is the Beatitudes acts as a table of contents for the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. And so as you look at sort of the Beatitudes and the kind of people that the good life belongs to, maybe what happened, especially in this particular section, is more of the how, the why, like what does that actually mean? If blessed are those who mourn, what does that actually look like in practice? And so that's kind of what I want to experiment with this morning, is I want to take the framework of the Beatitudes as context for the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, and I want to take that and see how it informs what sometimes gets referred to on your sheet as the 6 antitheses. How's that for a word this morning? Antitheses. So similar to the way that the Beatitudes follows a very similar structure of, the Beatitudes say, blessed are those who blank for blank. Like there's a repetition and a rhythm that it flows. These 6 antitheses, hopefully I won't have to say that too many times this morning, follows also another repeated pattern. It is, you have heard it said, followed by, but I tell you. So that's why it's called antitheses, obviously. There's something that's been said, and Jesus is speaking to another way of living. So on your tables, there should actually be a worksheet explaining what we're going to do a little bit. But I want to say, if the Beatitudes are context for the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, I want to explore how Jesus' words on divorce, oaths, retribution, all of that are connected to the Beatitudes. So in the context of the Beatitudes, how do we understand things like anger or truth or money? And obviously, this isn't going to be a one-for-one because there's 9 Beatitudes. There are 6 of these statements or 6 of these areas that Jesus tackles. But I want to kind of make the connection, if we could, this morning. And that's going to require some thinking. And so obviously, it's a lot. So I'll walk us through maybe piece by piece, give us a little bit of time on each. And maybe as we sort of get in the habit or the rhythm, this will go faster. We're not going to stop and debrief together at each one. But I do want to give you guys time at tables to work this out with each other. So, if you came as a passive participant, I am sorry. We're getting into it. But before we dive into that, I will give us a little bit of context. Just before this text, Jesus says that he has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. I think this is really fascinating. Part of me wonders if the reason why Jesus does this is, he is a new rabbi on the scene, right? And he is calling for this alternative community. He pronounces the Beatitudes, this group of people who are blessed that maybe, most society, most people would have looked at, and even themselves would have considered themselves downtrodden, right? So who is this new rabbi that suddenly emerges on the scene and is doing things very, counter to the way that things had been done, right? Before you sort of applied to your rabbi, here Jesus walks around, he's inviting people to follow him. Who is this guy? And so there could have been maybe a question mark around if Jesus is going to be someone who teaches a completely radical law, or like abolishes the law or something like that. And what Jesus actually says is that he's not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So if you thought that somehow Jesus was some like weird teacher that wasn't gonna, I don't know, pay attention to orthodoxy or something like that, he's like, no, actually, we're going hyper-orthodoxy. And what he's speaking to isn't necessarily the law itself, as much as he's addressing the faulty and false interpretations of that law. Right? So he's talking about the way that people have seen something and are looking for loopholes to somehow skirt the law. And he's getting them to the wisdom behind the law, the heart of that particular thing. And not only that, but he takes it a step further, saying that if you want to enter the kingdom, your righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And I just think, like, we read that and we're like, okay, but I think that would have been astounding to the original audience. Because think about this. I mean, the Pharisees and teachers of the law, these are people who devoted their whole life to figuring out what is righteousness, right? So they would have debated, and like, how far can you carry your mat before it's no longer considered in line with the Sabbath? Like, is it 5 feet? Is it 10 feet? Like, at what point? They would have figured out, they would have debated about whether or not, how much you can help your ox. Under which circumstances could you help your ox before you're in violation of the Sabbath? And so these guys devoted their whole life to the debate of what is righteousness and what isn't. And Jesus says to this crowd of people, somehow your righteousness has to exceed those guys. That would have been wild. It's like, unless you're a better basketball player than Michael Jordan, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. It's like, unless you can somehow be better than James Naismith, who invented the game, you cannot enter this kingdom. But I also wondered partially if it would have been humbling, because if the Beatitudes really are the backdrop of this text, and he's declaring to this downtrodden group of people that they're about to receive the good life, then I imagine it would have been easy for those people to believe that this was their moment. Right? Like, imagine that. Like, your whole life, you've been sort of, you're mourning, you're hungering, you're thirsting for righteousness, or would have been zealous in the crowd. So there's like a sense of, okay, like, justice is about to come in this moment. And I'm so excited for it, because we're about to no longer be destitute. We're about to be given power. This is our time. And what we know about human nature, if we've been without power, when we are given power, we want to use it the same way that it's been used against us. And we think that's equal. That's retribution. And Jesus stops that line of thinking in its tracks. The meek will inherit the earth, and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be satisfied, but it will not look the way that you think it will, and it will not come the way that you think that it should. You will see God. The kingdom is yours, but it means redefining your relationships to God, your fellow disciples, your spouse, the government, your enemies, even truth itself. Which takes us to our passage this morning and our exercise. What do Jesus' words here mean in light of the Beatitudes? So I want us to dive in. So the way this is going to work is we have slides. I'll give us a couple of minutes, and we don't have the full teaching of that antithesis on the slide, but you have the sheet in front of you. So this is, like I said, is going to require some work. You have the Beatitudes on your worksheet. And what I want that to do is just sort of provide context, right? So you don't always have to refer to it, but it is helpful to sort of use it to kind of wrap your head around, envision the community that Jesus is talking about. And then, so it might be helpful to read that first, read those Beatitudes first, and then spend some time reading that particular section of what we have on our handout from Matthew 5:21 through 48. And then take some time to figure out, okay, well then, if this is true, how did Jesus' words on anger and murder make sense in light of the Beatitudes? How does this teaching expound on one or two of these Beatitudes? And you guys can talk about that at your tables. Sounds like a lot of work. I hope you guys are ready to work because we got it in spades today. Sound good? Is that clear? So read the Beatitudes. Take some time on Matthew Matthew 5:21 through 48, the particular section that we're talking about, try to make the connection as a table. What are these two things do with each other? And I'll give a little bit of insight along the way. I'm not going to answer all your nitty-gritty details that will eventually come up as we look at this stuff because we don't have time for all that. But first thing first is Jesus' teaching on murder and anger. So this is, you have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to court, and anyone who says, you fool, be in danger of the fire of hell. Heavy. So what I'll say, just as a little bit of insight as you guys are getting ready to grapple with the Beatitudes in this particular section, is that murder would have related to the sixth commandment in the Ten Commandments. Raka means empty-headed. It's a term of contempt. In Jewish culture, to call someone by a name or an insulting name would have been tremendously offensive, right? Because it was to strip their identity away and substitute that for an offensive identity, actually. And you fool had moral connotations. It wasn't just that you were an idiot, but there was something moral there. There was a challenge to your character. And obviously, he's talking brother or sister. So this isn't just like anybody, but to your fellow disciples in some way. And so go ahead, take some time, look at the Beatitudes, read through it quick, and then take some time with verses 21 through 26 and figure out, okay, in light of the Beatitudes, how does this kind of shed light on this meaning? Which Beatitudes relate and how? All right, let's keep moving. Let's get to our next subject, adultery and lust. These are fun topics, Jesus. Thank you. So, you have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And there's more to the text as you can look at, what is that? That would be 27 through 30. But what I'll give you in terms of insight is that this could be translated as someone who's looking with the intention to lust or to desire somebody. So this isn't the same as like you find somebody attractive and all of a sudden you're guilty of lust. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. But it's actually it's the stare beyond the stare. You know what I'm saying? Like the consumption of a person for your own gratification, right? Like I think I heard John Piper say once, it's not the first look, it's the second look. That's the lust piece. And so that's what Jesus is actually talking about here. It's looking at them like they exist for your own pleasure. And when we do that, we are fellow human of their God-given dignity, even if we keep our hands to ourselves. This is the Bible Project. Bible Project talks about this. And so go ahead, take some time. In light of the Beatitudes, how does this make sense? How did Jesus on adultery and lust make sense in light of the Beatitudes? And which one or two of the Beatitudes seem most to align with this teaching and how? So go ahead, take some time at your tables to unpack that with each other. All right, let's keep pushing forward. Let's move on to divorce and Jesus' words on divorce. This is verses 31 and 32. Of course, it has been said that anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. So a little bit of insight here that might be helpful to know is that this actually isn't a commandment but a regulatory thing that comes from Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. So in Jesus' time, this is kind of really interesting. I didn't know this until kind of looking at this passage, that divorce in that time would have been something that was only initiated by a man. Women didn't initiate divorce in that time because actually in terms of women's agency and power and what they were capable of doing without sort of a man in their life was very limited, right? So they were kind of dependent on men. And so in that time, divorce was always initiated by a man, and there was actually controversy under which grounds was divorce okay and permissible. One thought would have been like, you could just be unhappy, and you could just find somebody else more attractive, and that was grounds for divorce. But maybe a more conservative view would have said, actually, sexual morality is the only case under which the divorce is maybe permissible. And it's not even necessarily that it's divorce as much as it's the recognition that the original covenant, the original relationship, no longer exists the same way that it did before. And so Jesus here is actually going with that more conservative view. And it's a way to actually protect women, because if you could just divorce women for any reason and they don't have any agency on their own, well, then what happens to them? They can be easily taken advantage of. And so go ahead, around your table, similar exercise. You know how this goes by now. Beatitudes, this teaching, how do these two things inform each other? And so go ahead, take a moment or two at your tables. All right, friends, let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about oaths. This is the next one in our list. It says, again, you've heard it said to the people long ago, do not break your oath. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, and then there's more. And just for the sake of context here, I'll say that similar to divorce, this isn't something that's like a part of the Ten Commandments as much as it was something that was put in place because of human failure, right? And so, like, there was a need, like there was a way that people were actually misusing swearing oaths and making promises, that it was like if you swore to God or swore by God, there was you knew that, okay, this person meant it, like they were serious, and that was how they were going to fulfill their word. So what people would do is that they would say, oh, I swear by Jerusalem, or I swear by God's throne, because if they didn't fulfill it, it was like, well, I didn't swear by God, I swore by the great city. I swore by God's throne, which isn't God himself. And so there's a way that they were trying to kind of get out of keeping their word. And so Jesus' point here is that, don't use God's name as a way to deceive people, right? Like, people of integrity, people of honesty. And so this isn't saying, for those of you who like find yourself in situations like court or whatever, where you have to take some sort of legal oath, that you got to be like, well, sorry, Jesus told me not to take an oath ever at all. So do with that what you will, right? That's not what Jesus is saying here. Or maybe he is saying that, but because of human depravity and sin, there's still room for legal oaths in our time. So go ahead, take a couple of moments, Beatitudes, this teaching, the connection, and then we'll move forward. All right, let's talk about retribution. So just as a word, Jesus is condemning the way that the law of retaliation had been abused, right? So initially the law of retaliation, the eye for an eye thing, would have been put in place to prevent someone from, they killed your ox on accident, and so then you go ahead and like murder their family. Like, that's extreme, right? Like, the law of retaliation was like, okay, let's keep things even here. And actually, it was something that people weren't even supposed to institute, as much as it was more of like a legal court system type deal, right? But Jesus is advocating for something else entirely, like being so concerned with peace that you're not even concerned about getting even, right? Like, it's a crazy thing. And the whole like smack on the cheek, this would have been insult to injury, because in order to get smacked on your right cheek by someone's right hand, they had to use the back of their hand, which was to see you as like inferior, right? And so Jesus is talking about insult to injury here. So not just the physical pain, but also the insult of it, and choosing instead of just not retaliating, like non-violence as a way to bring peace. And so go ahead, take a moment around your tables, talk about the Beatitudes, this particular teaching, and then we'll move on to our last one. All right, let's go to our last one. This is love your enemies. So you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And there's obviously more here, but a common person was at the mercy of Romans everywhere. They had little to no power to execute justice or protect themselves, right? And so if they came to you and said, here, you got to take this a mile, you just had to take it a mile. You had to grit your teeth and bear it. And so in ancient Israel, taking a poor person's coat was against the law, but it was also their blanket to keep warm at night. But a really uncaring person could find a way around this by demanding their shirt as payment. And so what Jesus is saying, give it both. Give both away. And so value peace more than getting even. Have a bold and creative response to evil. And so go ahead, take a moment. Last one, Beatitudes, this particular teaching. And then we'll talk about it just a little bit before moving on. when I was looking up stuff on this, I did find some notes from a commentary. One commentary actually did this very thing, and I don't want to go through each of this, but a couple of things that I thought were interesting. To Jim's point, is that those who are meek do not impose their will on others, so they will understand God's purposes for marriage and will not seek to divorce a spouse. Well done. Straight out of the answer book. Or those who are hunger and thirst for righteousness do not need an oath to vouch for their honesty, but will always speak the truth. So they made that connection. Another one was, the pure in heart will love both friend and foe, the entire world for whom Jesus gave his life. And peacemakers are sons of God and sons of their Father in heaven as they love those who persecute them. And so, great job, everybody. I know that was a bit much, but I think it was helpful for us to kind of enter into the text and to sort of grapple with this. So I think a lot of us, if we've studied the Sermon on the Mount in house church or in Bible studies, we're used to kind of taking it piece by piece and maybe sort of grappling with, like, what does Jesus actually mean? Like, how literally do we take this? How does this work out in, like, practical, everyday-to-day life? And I think there's something beautiful about taking this as a comprehensive unit. And what we see here is that the good life is for those who move past status quo faith of bare minimums to practice a life of righteousness that comes from within. A righteousness that values peace more than retribution, that believes the image of God in another person is more sacred than their personal gratification, that embodies the kind of integrity whose word is as good as done, a righteousness that is marked by radical and sacrificial love even to their enemies. You know, it made me think about this week, one of my fears. So the staff team knows that I have a list of irrational fears. Does anybody else have irrational fears? Some of you are like, all fear is irrational. I'm not talking to you. Good for you. I'm talking about, like, you're afraid that one day you're going to choke on a marshmallow kind of fear. So you, like, avoid marshmallows entirely. Like, that kind of irrational fear. Anybody? No, just me. Not saying that marshmallow thing is my thing. Although I think I did see something about a story about a woman dying from playing Chubby Bunny or something. I don't know. That's not in the notes, but there you go. Among my list of irrational fears, there was a time where people were taking pictures of folks on the street. I think this probably still happens. I'm just not on social media enough to know. But they would take pictures of random people on the street and they would, like, make some snide comment, or then people would, like, become memes or whatever. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, people who accidentally become memes. That's, like, one of my fears, is that I'm going to end up on someone's random social media page, end up as a meme and go viral, and that it'd just be me looking like a fool or something like that. But chief among my fears, of my biggest irrational fears, is ending up on an episode of What Would You Do? Do you guys know that show? Does everybody remember that show? All right. Well, check this out. So What Would You Do is, if for those unfamiliar, it is a show of social experiments of sorts. It takes people and puts them in situations that would be otherwise tense or, I don't know, I guess hostile or whatever, just to see how people would react. So imagine this. So, like, a scenario might be you go to a restaurant and you notice that a customer is acting really rude to a waitress or a waiter. What do you do? Do you just eat your meal like nothing's going on? Do you be extra nice to the waiter or waitress when they come to your table because you want to compensate for the other person's lack of care? Do you say something to the customer that's being rude to the waitress? Or do you just leave? Like, there's a whole list of possibilities of what you could do. And the thing is, you have no idea that everyone who's involved is an actor. But you're in the situation, and their cameras are on you looking at what you're going to do in that given situation. And they're like people in a control room. They're trying to figure out, okay, well, what if we do this? So maybe, like, it seems like it's just a mild disagreement and that you're just kind of ignoring and going back to eating your chopped salad. And then they decide it gets verbally abusive. Now what are you going to do? And maybe you're like, oh, this is really uncomfortable. But then maybe they decide they're going to up the ante again, and it gets physically abusive and violent, and you're like, oh snap, what are you going to do, right? And maybe at that point you leave, or sometimes they'll switch it out, and maybe it's like a manager that's berating a waiter or waitress, trying to figure out people's their engagement with what's going to happen. And this goes on for a while until the camera crew and the host come out and say, hey, this is an episode of What Would You Do? And I'm so and so, and we're just curious about why you did or didn't do what you did. And so there you are, Adrenaline super heightened from this crazy interaction, and now you have a camera and a microphone in your face asking you not just why you did or didn't do what you did, but yeah, like you're not just like observing your actions, but also trying to get to what's going on inside of you as all this is happening. And as I was thinking about it, I imagine they signed some sort of media release form, but just the idea that you could potentially be syndicated on national TV as a coward in front of the entire world for something that was super intense scares the living daylights out of me. I don't know. I would hate for it to happen to me. It scares me even now as I talk about it. It's like if I'm going to be caught on camera, I want to be caught on camera doing the right things, right? It's similar with the meme thing. Like, don't just take a picture of me like jamming out to Vanessa Carlton in my car and then make me something on the internet, which is very possible to happen, by the way. But like, get me doing something virtuous or right or something. It matters less to me whether or not people know I'm happy about whatever good thing I just did, as long as they see me do the right thing. That's what I want. Can I please just do the right thing and be perceived as the right kind of person? The reason why it terrifies me is because if I'm honest, I'm much more concerned with appearing righteous than being righteous. I can settle for the status quo. I think I can avoid committing murder. I think I can avoid committing adultery. I hope. What we see here is that while that might be a devout religious life, it is not a blessed one. It's not a life that inherits the kingdom. I imagine most of us who've studied this Sermon on the Mount are used to taking it piece by piece, but taking it as a unit, I was struck by the repetition of "you've heard it said, but I tell you." It seems to me that this is the essence of Jesus' lordship in our life. What did Jesus tell you? Not the news or local legislators, not friends or whoever the latest influencer is, not common or public sentiment, or even your private common sense. What did Jesus tell you? It made me think about little kids when they ask you for something and you don't answer the way that they want to. And what's the first thing that they do? They run to somebody else to somehow get there to validate what they're feeling or their desires, right? Like, you're not going to give it to me, but these people, they might. So I'm going to go to mom, or I'm going to go to auntie, or either they get older, right? Parents, you know this happens. Well, everyone else is doing it. So-and-so's parents are letting them go or let them do this thing. And what's the response? What do you respond to them? You say, I don't care what those people tell you. I don't care what they said. I don't care what they think. What did I tell you? I'm not Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. You're not one of the Wilson kids. You are my kid. And if you're going to belong to me, this is what I tell you. It's about authority. It's not about running to people to confirm their desires. It's about authority and belonging. And as much as kids do it, if I'm honest, I do it too. We do it too. We want to look for authorities that agree with us and confirm our desires. And if we're honest, a status quo faith agrees with us. Loving our neighbors and hating our enemies, that agrees with us. Eye for an eye, that agrees with us. Not only that, but it's how everyone around us lives. It's how they operate. But what if this is the essence of belonging to Jesus? You have heard it said, but I tell you blank. We want to know how literally we're supposed to take this, how seriously Jesus expects us to live into it, if he actually expects us to follow this, or if it's meant to be a spotlight that highlights our need for grace. We come with what ifs and justifications, and the Sermon on the Mount exposes us because Jesus always takes us a step further than we're comfortable going. If we want to inherit the kingdom, it's not enough to just settle for the status quo or for the spirit of the day. We must be righteous from the inside out, and failure to do so is to not enter the kingdom. Like, follow me here. Like, if the Beatitudes, if the Beatitudes are context for the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, part of what you saw as you're looking at the Beatitudes is that there's a description of a type of people, and then there's blessings or promises that follow that group of people. So, If that's true, that like it's the meek who inherit the earth, if you are not meek, you do not inherit the earth. It's simple as that. And if that's true, then what happens in this text, if it's connected to the Sermon on the Mount, is that to fail to practice the righteousness Jesus outlines here is to not inherit the good life. You do not receive the good life. If you choose to devalue another person through murder or insult, then the kingdom is not yours. If you choose to devalue truth, you will not see the face of God. You will not inherit the earth. You will not be shown mercy. The kingdom is not yours. It's so serious that if the reason for your temptation could be localized to a single part of your body, it'd be better to live without it than to continue in a life of sin. Better to suffer the pain of amputation and loss than to experience total lostness outside the kingdom. It's so serious to Jesus that Jesus gives the image of someone who travels 80 miles with an animal to the temple, gets to the temple, realizes something's not right, leaves the animal there, travels back for a week, like that's a week-long journey to make things right, to come back to the temple and offer the sacrifice that they left behind. It's hyperbolic, but you get the picture. You can live a religious life, but it's not the same as a blessed one. And if we're honest, we have respectable sins and acceptable levels of righteousness. Things that we justify or hold on to in our hearts. We know what Jesus says, but we dismiss it in the next breath because it doesn't seem realistic. Maybe we tell ourselves it's not that bad or we could be worse, but I don't know if it works that way. In fact, earlier this week, kind of in preparation for this talk, I was listening to a book called Respectable Sins. I was like, what is like the modern equivalent of this? And what's interesting is that as I was reading this book called Respectable Sins, the entire time I was thinking to myself, is that sin? I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. I think that's a little much. And I was like, oh, but I wonder, that's the point, isn't it? That like, I respect that sin. If it's actually sin, right? I'm still on the fence, but it's respectable. So I'm like, I don't know. It could not be. In fact, I kind of went to the staff team and I was like, well, hey guys, what about this? Do you think this is a sin? And they're like, I don't know, maybe not. And so we were actually on the fence about it. I didn't tell them that I was running a social experiment, but I was trying to see what they would do. But we didn't quite know. I was looking to some other source or authority to confirm my suspicions or my doubts. I mentioned earlier that, John Mayer, not John Mayer, but what would you do, although you might see me jamming out to John Mayer. I mentioned what would you do as an irrational fear. I did have a moment like that this past October. The reason why I talk about John Mayer is because it was a John Mayer concert. This was October. My wife and I, we were going to see John Mayer. Solo concert, great, wonderful. I think we were like parked by the county building or something. We had to walk to Amalie. Like that was the situation. And so there's already like the pre-concert jitters. Like for me, I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Is he going to play this? Is he not going to play this? We're like catching up on life, my wife and I. I'm pretty sure we were talking about the underground. I don't know what we were talking about. I'm pretty sure it's something organizational, but we're walking. And there comes a moment as we're walking down the street that this guy dressed as a shrub jumps out and tries to scare me. He's dressed as a shrub, and he jumps out of nowhere to scare me. And like, guys, I had my jacket, and I like swung at him. I was like, "What's wrong with you, man?" And so it was like this moment, and like Bree is like mortified, like embarrassed. Like the people behind me are laughing because they're like, oh yeah, don't mess with that guy. He's going to end up on TikTok or something like TikTok. And I was like, this is all my worst fears in a moment. Like, what would you do? I'm going to go viral. It's going to be professional Christian gets violent at John Mayer concert. Like, this is the last thing I need. I was so upset. And yet, at the same time, I like was kind of like, well, was it justified? Is it like, was it self-defense? Like, was I protecting Bree? Like, what's going on here? And there was a moment, like, I looked at him, and I actually wanted to, like, pummel the guy. Like, I wanted to tackle him, and, like, you just don't do that. Like, you can't. I was so mad for a variety of reasons because You see it all the time. People doing stupid stuff online for the sake of going viral and getting views, and all the comment sections are like, oh, I can't believe people are so sensitive these days. It's like, no, you threw fake gang signs at gang members. What did you expect was going to happen to you? But anyway, I spent the whole night trying to figure out what's the state of my soul that's how I reacted to someone jumping out of a bush or whatever trying to scare me. I ended up texting Lucas a confession because I was wondering if I needed to turn myself into the governing elders. Did I just disqualify myself from ministry for attacking a guy dressed as a shrub? And his immediate response wasn't what happened. I mean, he laughed. He just texted me back, ha, 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 ha. And in all fairness, my text message said, and I quote, all right, confession time, just smacked a dude dressed as a shrub that jumped out and tried, quite successfully I might add, to scare me and Bree on the way to the John Mayer concert. And he just laughed. That's all he did. I mean, what do you do when you receive a text message like that? Even later, when Jeremy and I and Lucas, we were kind of walking to Chipotle to grab lunch, the subject came up, and we all just laughed. I mean, I get it. It's a surreal situation, and there are a million ways to justify it. But I think what convicted me then and convicts me now is just how did my actions show evidence of the fruit of the Spirit? Did my righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees? I may have ran to other sources to validate my actions, but actually it doesn't matter. I may have heard it said something from those people, but what did Jesus say? Guys, what are your respectable sins? Where do you draw the lines at appropriate levels of righteousness? Where in your lives are you tempted to settle for the status quo? Maybe you've heard things about money and giving, and you've accepted the status quo version of those things when Jesus invites us to a life of generosity. Maybe it's how we understand our personal security and protecting ourselves when living into the Beatitudes means living a life free of self-preservation. And maybe you actually don't need anything new. Maybe what Jesus wrote and what he said in this sermon is enough for us. I think about this guy at my gym. He's notorious for kind of checking out ladies and commenting to all the guys about different ladies' bodies. And occasionally he'll come up to me in the gym, he'll tap my shoulder and he'll be like, hey, you see this person? And usually I'm just like, bro, I'm focused. I'm doing something right now. Pay attention. Get your head in the game. But is that because I value the image of God in the other person? Or is it because I just don't want, it's a perception thing. I know Christians aren't supposed to. And I don't want him to be like, oh, well, Tomy's a Christian and he does this and he engages in this. What is actually my reason for that? Can you hear Jesus this morning beckoning you to go deeper, to move past the status quo, to be righteous from the inside out? Worship team, you can come on up. I'll wrap us up this morning. But in my procrastination on working on this talk, I was going down the YouTube wormhole, as one does. You try to figure out anything else you can do aside from work on your talk. You clean the gutters. I don't even have gutters, I don't think. But you figure out ways to do it. And so I was on YouTube going down the wormhole. And I came across the story of this kid in Louisiana who mistook a millionaire for a homeless person. Have you guys seen this story before? Have you heard of this? So it was funny. So I guess basically this little boy was accompanying his dad to his eye doctor appointment. His dad was getting glasses. I don't know how old this kid was. I'd be surprised he was a teenager. He was probably 10 if that. But he was accompanying his dad to this eye doctor appointment. And he sees this guy across the street outside of the coffee shop, dressed kind of scrubby, standing on the corner, holding himself and kind of talking to himself. And the boy, he had just gotten $1 from his parents because he had good grades in school. And so he had $1 in his pocket and saw this guy across the street and was like, I think he needs help. And so this little boy, I guess he cleared it with his dad, but walks across the street, goes to the coffee shop, walks up to this man and asks him, he offers this complete stranger, hey, do you need $1? Do you need help? Turns out that guy was the owner of the successful hunting store and was actually a multimillionaire. The reason he was dressed scrubby is because a fire alarm had gone off in his apartment complex that ended up being a false alarm. Nothing was actually wrong. And so he figured, well, might as well just start my day. I'm just going to grab whatever clothes I see and I'm going to head down to the coffee shop and I'm going to find a place to be alone and to pray and to like be with God before I actually start on my day. Hence why he was standing outside in a corner, and he wasn't just talking to himself, he was actually praying. That's what he was doing. He opens his eyes and sees this little kid with like finger rings all over his finger, and he's like, what is getting ready to happen to me? And he gets offered this $1, and he says, oh no, I'm not homeless. I actually live in the apartment complex right across the street. But I'm not going to take your $1. Instead, I think I want to buy you breakfast. And so the kid runs across the street, talks to his dad. His dad gives him the okay to like get breakfast from this stranger. His dad a coffee from the store. And I don't think it's until the news story breaks that the kid finds out that this guy is actually a millionaire. And part of what this guy does is he takes this kid to his hunting store. And like the news story was like this kid on a virtual hunting expedition shooting at dinosaurs. Like it's like a crazy story. It's wild. But he takes this kid to his store and gives him 40 seconds. He says, whatever you can grab in the next 40 seconds, it's yours, free of charge. And so you can imagine this kid goes bonkers. Like he grabs clothes, he grabs this like $1,000 bike, like not even just $1,000, like a couple $1,000 bike. He like grabs, I think, a hunting gun, maybe. I don't know if he actually let him keep said hunting gun, but he grabs all this stuff and he's giving it to him. But when they ask this kid, why did you do, like what prompted you to go up to this man, to offer him this $1? You know what his response was? His response was, I've always wanted to help a homeless person. I just never had the money to do it. And now I finally had $1, and I saw my moment, and I wanted to take advantage of it. I just thought, wow, what kind of kid is this? It wasn't about fear of exposure. It wasn't about doing the right outward action for the sake of optics. It wasn't even about some sort of immediate reward, even. It was him just trying. It wasn't even about him trying to do the right thing. It was like he was the right person. There's something, a purity of heart that prompted this external action, and his inward righteousness translated to outward action, and then in the end he receives a very real reward. And I looking at the story, I just couldn't help, I want to be like this kid so badly. Not afraid, not just trying not to do the wrong thing, but actively trying to be the right person. And this morning, I think it begins by taking Jesus at his word, at trusting his wisdom more than the wisdom of this age or what we internally feel to be right. You know, it occurs to me that as we look at this passage, Jesus isn't just talking to individuals or even just a small band of disciples, but he's talking to a lot of people. He's casting vision for a whole different kind of society. What if everyone were to live the Sermon on the Mount? It's not that this community is trying to be countercultural for the sake of being countercultural, but they're trying to embody the values of the kingdom, and because of that, it becomes countercultural. I think there's something powerful in that for us. Like, we're not trying to like live sacrificial lives because, just for the sake of each other, but there is a strength that comes from doing it with one another. A couple of weeks ago, I was with my wife. We went to Minnesota to visit Josh and Allison, although Josh was out of town, so it ended up being us with Allison and the kids. And, we're kind of like seeing all these cool sights in Minneapolis and hanging out and talking and just catching up on life. And the struggle that she's having is the struggle to really feel like, how do I embody underground values outside of the underground? When no one else is doing it. When it's not the thing that's around me. And we get it. Like, Bree and I, we spent years in the Cayman Islands away from you guys, and it's hard to do. It's not impossible. You don't do it because the underground does it. You does it because Jesus convicts you to do it. But there is strength in community, and there's a way that we provide that to each other. This morning, as we wrap up, I think the call is simple, that we have to renounce the status quo, renounce the authorities that agree with us so that we can practice a righteousness that grants us a good life. Doesn't matter what we've heard said from other people. What does Jesus say to us? And furthermore, can our network and our microchurches, can we be spaces and communities that commit to what Jesus is doing, even if no one else around us is doing it? Even if it looks foolish, even if the world tells us, actually, you're good enough, you're righteous enough. Can we do what Jesus says? Can we be Sermon on the Mount people? Doesn't matter what we've heard said. What does Jesus say to us? And maybe in that sense, it's only fitting that we come to the table, because as we're reminded that the table, the same disciples that would have been in that room with Jesus when he institutes the sacrament, would have been on that mount with him. And this moment, it's the culmination of all of his teachings, an invitation to share in it with him, to leave behind what they'd known, to receive a life that they couldn't have imagined, possibly. And maybe it was always going to cost them. And it always costs us. But the thing that you gain, what you gain is Jesus and fellowship with him in a unique way. You get the good life. And so it is with us. It is a reminder of the story that we're in, to whom we belong, and whom has the ultimate authority in our life. We take up our vocation again to be the people of God and do our best to be righteous from the inside out.